Good evening. Welcome to the Evolution and Human Adaptation Program's inaugural award ceremony for the Evolution and the Public Eye Award. I'd like to thank the Ann Arbor Public District Library for hosting us, and I'd also like to thank EHAP, which I'll explain a bit later, and those who helped organize the event, Tori, Kaylin, Nikki, and Walker. Thanks for all the help. Before I announce our award recipient, I'd like to share a brief history of the program that sponsors this recognition. The Evolution and Human Adaptation Program, or EHAP, has deep roots at the University of Michigan. It began in the 1980s as an informal discussion about sociobiology, which is an approach to explaining social behavior from an evolutionary perspective, grew into something transformative. In 1986, EHAP's precursor, the Evolution and Human Behavior Program, was formally established, making the University of Michigan a renowned center for evolutionary studies of human behavior. This initiative led directly to the creation of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, which is an international group of academic group consisting of psychologists, anthropologists, biologists, and other scientists that has become a world leader in that space. Now, tonight, we present the Evolution in the Public Eye Award, which is a new initiative honoring outstanding contributions to the public understanding of evolutionary perspectives on behavior. This award recognizes a special kind of scholarly contribution, one that involves not just speaking to scientists, but extending beyond academic journals to reach broader audiences. Whether it's through social media, blogs, academic outreach, or other forms of science communication, recipients have communicated evidence-based information, exposed misinformation, which is unfortunately not uncommon when it comes to evolution, and fostered more informed public discussion. In an era where scientific misinformation can spread rapidly, this work is more important than ever. So the EPI Award recognizes those who help ensure that evolutionary perspectives are represented accurately. Okay, and now this year's recipient. It's my great pleasure to announce that the 2025 Evolution in the Public Eye Award goes to Dr. Ed Hagen, Professor of Anthropology at Washington State University. Ed exemplifies everything this award represents. His work demonstrates how evolutionary science can address pressing questions about human behavior while remaining rigorously evidence-based and accessible to diverse audiences. He has written clear, accessible explanations of complex ideas in publications and lectures and popular science writing, and he is thoughtful and thankfully patient contributor to social media conversations on a wide range of topics. What makes Ed particularly deserving in this commitment to confronting misconceptions head on? His work directly addresses misunderstandings, demonstrating how modern evolutionary science accounts for plasticity, cultural diversity, and avoids the deterministic and simplistic thinking that sometimes goes along with this approach. For instance, when a sociological critique titled "Is Evolutionary Psychology Possible?" challenged the field's foundations, Ed's detailed response called "Is Evolutionary Psychology Impossible?" Systematically addressed those criticisms and clarified what evolutionary approaches actually claim. His cross-cultural research in small-scale societies has been particularly valuable, where he's demonstrated how evolutionary explanations can account for both human universals and cultural variation. His research on the potential functional benefits of tobacco and psychedelic drug use is a topic I'm pretty sure we're going to hear more about in just a bit. Through his career, Ed has consistently shown how evolutionary perspectives can provide nuanced, evidence-based insights into human behavior while avoiding oversimplification. He builds bridges between rigorous research and public understanding, does not take misconceptions lightly, and demonstrates that evolutionary science enriches rather than constrains our understanding of what it means to be human. Please join me again in congratulating Dr. Ed Hagen. This award is for you.
Thank you, Josh, very much for that wonderful introduction. I will try and live up to that tonight. I was asked to say a few words on my philosophy of science communication. So the first few minutes of my talk are going to kind of go through that, and then we're going to switch to some actual science. But this event here, which probably most of you are unfamiliar with, thank God, but some of you might be familiar with. This was a book published by a self-identified journalist, Patrick Tierney, in the year 2000. This was right when I just got my PhD at UC Santa Barbara. And as you can see, it's called Darkness in El Dorado: How Scientists and Journalists Devastated the Amazon. And the targets of this book were James Neal, a prominent geneticist here in Michigan, and my master's thesis advisor, Napoleon Chagnon. And the book accused both of them of conducting a horrific experiment on native South Americans, a group called the Yanomamo, using a dangerous measles vaccine, according to the book. And this book, of course, these accusations were explosive. And we first heard about them from an email that was sent by two anthropologists warning of an imminent anthropological scandal. And of course, this sent all of us into shock. What the heck is going on here? So we managed to get galleys of the book so we could begin understanding what these accusations were and what was the basis of them. And we almost immediately were able to debunk almost the entire book. And we got in touch with the original developers of the measles vaccine, one of whom had won a Nobel Prize. We didn't get in touch with him specifically, but really prominent folks in the vaccine area. And they basically said, no, this vaccine was licensed for use, it was safe, it was effective. And measles, as some of you might know, is when it infects a indigenous group that's never been exposed to measles before, the mortality rates can reach 20%. It's a horrific disease if it sweeps through these communities. And so the truth was that Neal and Chagnon, far from conducting a nefarious experiment with the measles vaccine, had learned that measles was spreading in this area and had contacted the CDC and had obtained hundreds and hundreds of doses of measles vaccine to protect these communities. And so they had brought all the vaccines in to protect the communities, not to conduct any experiment. And in fact, the vaccine had already been used in native South American communities very successfully. And so really they had saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. So how did this book ever get published? And it was meticulously, it seemed to be meticulously documented, had hundreds and hundreds of citations backing up all these claims. So my job as this newly minted PhD was to go into these stacks at UCLA and the medical stacks. And I was really literally pulling out these old vaccine trials from the 1950s and 1960s, blowing all the dust off them. And what this journalist had done is really selectively snipped out quotes from these articles and basically absolutely reversed their meaning. The meaning of what the articles were actually saying was literally the opposite of what the journalist was claiming they were saying. And we got this information out, and I remember very distinctly as almost a grad student still, I just had gotten my PhD, I was sending out emails to our department with everything I had discovered. And I was just met with resounding silence. And I was like, what's going on here? I'm showing that this stuff is just completely made up bunk. I couldn't understand what was going on. Is it just me? But no, University of Michigan, they also, because their folks were involved, they put a team on it, and they were finding the same things I was finding, that Tierney had completely, utterly turned his sources upside down and quoted them as saying the opposite of what they were saying. The National Academy of Sciences did the same, came to the same conclusion. The International Genetic Epidemiology Society came to the same conclusion. Other societies said everything this guy is saying that we can actually check is wrong. It's actually the opposite of what he is saying. Nevertheless, the American Anthropological Association felt compelled, despite this rapid debunking, to establish a task force to investigate. And to understand this, you need to understand a little bit about the sort of politics of anthropology. Chagnon, my MA advisor, and Neil were very much on the science side of anthropology. But at this time in the 90s, anthropology as a discipline, and even today, was really undergoing a lot of conflict between anthropologists who really wanted to continue doing anthropology in a very scientific way, and anthropologists who are much more concerned, understandably, I think, with activism and helping communities rather than doing research on them. And this led to a lot of conflict in our discipline. And so despite the fact that we were able to debunk this book very quickly, there were many, many anthropologists that were, and there's a lot of internal politics that I won't bore you with, but many anthropologists really were pushing for an investigation. Basically, they didn't like Chagnon, is what it boils down to. Now, the members of this task force had severe conflicts of interest. Actually, one was a former Chagnon student, so that's a very clear conflict of interest. But another was a student of Turner's who had been one of the folks really promoting this book. Other folks were people who had published criticisms in the past of Chagnon. It was a hopelessly compromised task force. Nevertheless, it went forward. And in 2002, a couple years later, it basically found that Neil and Chagnon had indeed were guilty of inappropriate conduct. And this was extremely disappointing to us, those of us who had been working tirelessly to show how unfounded all these accusations were. But then two other academics, Tom Greger and Dan Gross, said, you know what? The AA doesn't have any authority to conduct this kind of inquiry. In fact, their bylaws explicitly say we cannot conduct ethical inquiries. And the whole thing was kind of a kangaroo court. There was no due process. Chagnon, nobody representing Chagnon appeared, none of that stuff. So a referendum was put forward by these two other anthropologists to rescind this report accusing these two guys of inappropriate conduct. And the thing I'm highlighting down here at the bottom is that referendum to rescind that report passed overwhelmingly. So the lesson that I learned from that I have used in all of my science communication is there's a large audience out there that you don't hear from. In fact, 90% of the people out there, you hear all the loud voices that are accusing you of this and that, but there's a large fraction of the world that is listening carefully. They're never going to give you any feedback that they're hearing you, but they are. If you give calm, logical, evidence-based arguments, your message will get through. And so in my science communication, I've always known that I'm never going to get any. In fact, this award was a huge surprise. I think it's the first award I've ever gotten. So I am very honored to get this award. It really does mean a lot because I do put a huge effort into my science communication. And the philosophy that I use is present folks with the evidence calmly and with logical arguments, and they are listening. And it will make an impact. You're not going to get the positive feedback. You're not going to get people, speaking up in support of you, but they are there and they're listening. And when it comes down to it, you're going to get the votes. Now, a second very similar experience was not with me personally, but I have told you a little bit about these science wars. The science wars were kind of this conflict between more scientifically oriented anthropologists and more humanistically oriented anthropologists. And so this survey a few years later basically was sent out anonymously to the entire membership of the AAA. And it basically asked, what's your opinion on all these controversial topics? And there's a large number of them. I won't go into detail about any of them. But if you know anything about anthropology, anthropology in general and cultural anthropology specifically is probably one of the more left-wing woke disciplines on the planet. And those loud voices, you're never going to hear them saying anything nice about evolutionary approaches to human behavior, which they equate with genetic determinism, as Josh just told you. And so you might think that those guys would just be adamantly opposed to evolutionary approaches to behavior. Well, one of the questions was, do evolutionary biological perspectives contribute scientifically? And what you can see is archaeologists, this is the percent agree and percent disagree. 61% of them agreed, only 17% disagreed. Among biological anthropologists, 77% agreed, only 8% disagreed. And then among cultural anthropologists, shocking to me, 41% actually agreed. So 41 to 38 is not too bad. It's a 50-50 split. So I'm a glass half full guy. So if we can, and you never hear that. I was shocked to see cultural anthropologists, almost half of them, even more than half of them, endorsing evolutionary biological perspectives and agreeing that they do contribute. So that is really where my philosophy has come from. Now, the final one is Daniel Dennett. He's a very famous philosopher. He passed away a couple years ago. But he has these famous 4 principles for critique. And I also try and follow these. I won't say that I always do it religiously, but you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, so vividly and fairly that your target says, thanks, I wish I thought of putting it that way. So I always endeavor to really try and see the other side and be fair to their arguments if I can. Sometimes it's hard. You should list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. You should mention anything you learned from your target. And only then are you permitted to say as much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. And so actually in the article or the blog post that Josh mentioned, the post criticizing evolutionary psychology, I tried to follow these principles in my response. And apparently it got me an award. So it paid off. And then the final thing, of course, is my wife. She actually edits all of my stuff very carefully to make sure I'm not pissing everybody off, make sure what I'm saying is understandable. And so I owe a lot to her very wise editorial touch. Okay, so that is sort of my story about how I do my science communication. I think that's the less interesting part, I hope. What I'm going to now talk about is my science, or some of it. And I hope that's why all of you are here. And one of my main areas of research is trying to understand why we all love these things. So coffee, tea, pepper, cannabis, tobacco are extremely popular substances. And we may think of them differently. We may think of these guys as foods. We may think of this guy as a spice. We may think of these guys as drugs. But really, they are all plant substances that don't have any nutrients in them. They don't have any protein. They don't have any fat. They don't have any carbohydrates. What do they have? They have toxins. What are called plant secondary compounds. Those are these guys up here. Caffeine, of course, here. THC here. Nicotine here. These are all plant toxins. We're going to come back to that theme quite a bit. So why is it that these things are so dang popular? And in fact, they are so popular that I want to kind of make the strong argument that our taste for these kinds of plant substances has really shaped the modern world. So this is an archaeological study in southern Vietnam right here. The site is 2,000 years old, right around the time of Christ. And at this site, they found evidence for spices from all these regions around the world. And they reconstruct these trade routes for how those spices in this fairly large region of the planet all ended up in southern Vietnam 2,000 years ago. And so what that shows is that even back then, and probably long before, folks were engaging in extensive trade in these plant substances that seemingly have no benefit, in fact, just are full of toxins. What the heck is going on? Now, here is stuff that we may be more familiar with. This is the spice trade in 16th century Europe, Portugal specifically. In this particular study, was just looking at the manifests of cargo ships that were coming into this one port in Portugal. And these are in tons here, so 100, 200, 300, 400 tons. And almost all the holds were full of pepper and very little other stuff in these ships. So tons and tons. And this is 1 year in 1518, right here. And where was this pepper coming from? Southern India. And it was actually, there were hunter-gatherer groups up in the mountains and up in the hills that were collecting it and bringing it down to the coast in vast quantities. Again, illustrating this huge demand. And as we all know from our elementary school history classes, the spice trade was key to colonialism and European expansion. And even today, this is the global spice trade today. This is 2019 data. These are in metric tons. This is on a log scale. So here's 1 billion tons. This is wheat for comparison. Then we got 100 million tons, 10 million tons, 1 million, da-da-da. Onions, chili peppers, garlic, coffee, tobacco, tea, cocoa, onions, chilies, ginger, spices, miscellaneous spices, oreganonuts, coriander, mustard seeds, blah, 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 blah. Immense trade even today in all these substances, illustrating that we need to understand, why do we like this stuff so much, or want this stuff? And then this, of course, is not limited to legal things like spices and tobacco and coffee, but also illegal drugs. This is just one from a recent drug report of trade routes for cocaine from South America, all over the world. And this illegal drug trade is having a massive impact on our society. This is just one study. So in 2010, folks finally figured out that prescription opioids were causing huge problems with addiction here in the US. So there was a policy change to really restrict access, re-restrict access to prescription opioids. And as a consequence of that, users switched to heroin, much of which is grown in Mexico. So after a pretty short period of time, heroin fields or poppy fields were sprouting up in Mexico to supply the heroin into the United States. And the violence from that were driving Mexicans out of those regions, out of those heroin producing regions, some of them into other areas of Mexico and other areas of the US. So this is showing a causal effect of the opioid epidemic here on Mexicans, and consequently forcing, in this case, they were able to determine that it displaced about almost 100,000 people within Mexico, and then another 22,000 just from this one policy change of migration into the US. And of course, migration into the US is driving a lot of our current politics. So just to illustrate that our taste, our insatiable taste for these toxic plants is really shaping the world that we live in today. And finally, this is global drug mortality. So this entire rectangle represents the total deaths from everything, from cancers, from accidents, from suicides, from heart attacks, everything, globally, around the world. And this on the right are the fraction or proportion of those deaths attributable to these drugs right here, tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs. And so what you can see is about 20% of mortality is traceable to use of these drugs. So another aspect of their impact on our society. Okay. So what I'm going to present a hypothesis. I'm going to admit from the outset that we're kind of at the beginning of this. And so I have quite a bit of evidence, but I don't have proof. It's still very much an active area of research. But the question is, what is it about us humans that drives us to seek out these substances that seemingly offer no benefits? And what I'm going to argue that there was a major change in the human diet about 2.5 million years ago that led to what we all went through a few years ago, which is a spillover of increasing numbers of spillovers of dangerous pathogens from other animals into humans. And that we that then selected for a propensity. In other words, through evolution by natural selection, we began to seek out plants that had medicinal properties. So what I'm going to argue is that all of these plants like coffee and tea and pepper and tobacco, we should think of them as pharmaceutical drugs or pharmacological drugs, not just drugs. So how does that argument work? So first we have to talk about the evolution of the human diet. So I'm going to give you a quick crash course in that. I'm going to come back to this diagram over and over and over, but this is kind of a diagram of our evolution. So on the far left is a period 8 million years ago. This is called the late Miocene. And I've chosen that date because that is when we had shared a last common ancestor with our closest relatives today, chimpanzees. So the chimpanzee lineage and the human lineage parted ways sometime in this time frame here in the late Miocene. And over on the far right, we have the modern day. So what we're going to do is kind of walk through time here from that time period 6 to 8 million years ago to today. So what was our diet and our life like 6 to 8 million years ago? We were apes, probably an ape very similar to what a chimp is today. There's still debate about that. But our last common ancestor with the chimps was probably pretty chimp-like. And at that time period in the late Miocene, the climate, that's illustrated with this jaggedy line here. So this dotted line is modern day average global temperature. That's the 0 point. Anything above that is a warmer climate. Anything below that is a cooler climate. And although my data don't extend all the way back into the Miocene, other data sets do. And basically we were at about 5 degrees Celsius warmer on average across the globe back then than we are today. So it was a warm, wet climate. It was full of, basically everywhere was a tropical forest everywhere. Large parts of the planet were tropical forests inhabited by apes, including our last common ancestor. And this is what an ape diet looks like. It's basically plants. It's fruits, these guys, and leaves. And so we started out as plant eaters. And this is important because plant-based diets are chock full of all those toxic compounds I just talked about. Plants don't want to be eaten. And so they evolve lots of defense mechanisms, thorns, shells, other defense mechanisms, including toxins to defend themselves. So these guys are eating a lot of plant-based diet, but what's flowing through their system is a lot of those compounds that are in those spices and drugs today. We'll come back to that point. Okay, now, crash course, I told you. We're moving into the Pliocene. This is starting about 5 million years ago. And what you can see here in our climate chart here is the climate is beginning to cool through the Pliocene. And it will actually cool a lot more. And what that means is it's drying out and these tropical forests are shrinking. And for reasons that we still don't fully understand, our ancestors begin to inhabit, instead of the tropical forest that chimps still inhabit today, our ancestors are beginning to inhabit a more open, patchy environment. And we see another diet shift. So this is a modern day chimp. And this guy is one of those early human ancestors called Australopithecines. This is Lucy. Many of you may have heard of her. And what I want you to point out here is notice the chimp jaw versus Lucy's. So from this up here, the brains are the same size. From here up, these guys look pretty similar. But from here down, they're quite different. Lucy's got this massive jaw. And here is a chimp jaw. And looking up at it, this is Lucy's jaw here. This is a human jaw here. And what I want to point out is Lucy's got these huge teeth. And so what we infer is that the Australopithecines, as they move from a forest environment into a more grassland environment, begin to eat much tougher, still plant-based foods, but more seeds, more nuts, things that required heavy dental processing. And we actually can conduct chemistry on the bones of these early Australopithecines. And using a technique called stable isotope analysis, nitrogen, this is all complicated stuff, but the basic idea is that one of the main things we get from foods are proteins, and proteins, one of the major constituents of that is nitrogen. And there's a type of nitrogen called nitrogen 15, which is quite rare. But we incorporate the nitrogen in our foods into our bodies. And so we can measure those levels of nitrogen. And what matters here is that herbivores down here have low levels of this nitrogen 15 in their bones, in their collagen, actually. Whereas carnivores in the blue here, meat eaters, have much higher levels of nitrogen 15. So by analyzing the bone chemistry and the collagen chemistry, we can determine, are they eating mostly plants, in which their case they're down here, or if their nitrogen levels are down here, they're eating mostly plants, or are they eating mostly meat, then their nitrogen levels are up here. And what we see is with these Lucy type folks, these were actually a different species of Australopithecus, but they're right down here with the herbivores. So this confirms that these early guys are eating mostly plants, although a different type of plant. Okay, now we move into the Pleistocene. This is also called the Ice Age. And what you can see is that temperatures are now plunging below this dotted line. And now I'm going to bring in this panel. These are small and medium-sized herbivores. And the red dots are these guys, and the purple dots are these guys. And what you can see, this is the relative biomass of these guys in the fossil record. And what you can see is it's going up. So why are these guys increasing? Well, because they eat grass. So as the forests shrink and the grasslands expand through this entire period, the numbers of these animals, these small and medium-sized herbivores that are feeding on the grasslands, increases. And that's important because that is now a new food source. But it's a meat-based food source, not a plant-based food source. And what we see, starting right about here, which is about 2.5 million years ago, are three things. This is our transition to a hunting and gathering lifestyle. These are some kids I worked with in Central Africa. They were practicing hunting here. But the fossil evidence, this is a picture of it. This is East Africa. And what we find simultaneously, right around 2.5 million years ago, with this climate change and the onset of the Ice Age and the rise of this new food source of herbivores, is we find stone tools pretty much for the first time. We find cut marks on bones, meaning that whoever made those stone tools was cutting up animals. And we've seen the first fossil evidence of our genus Homo. This is not Homo sapiens, but this is early Homo. So this is all coming together, suggesting that this is when we begin to transition from a almost thoroughly plant-based diet to a diet that's now much more a mix of animal foods and plant foods. And just to illustrate with some modern data, these are chimps. Chimps do hunt, and that's very interesting. They hunt monkeys and sometimes small forest antelopes, but it's a very small part of their diet. The red part here is the animal meat. The green part here is the plant-based, and it's actually pretty generous to say that chimp diets might be as much as 5%. Meat, it's probably even less than that. How does that compare to modern-day hunter-gatherers? Modern-day hunter-gatherers typically range between about 40 to 60% meat in the diet, so dramatically more than chimps. We still have a lot of plants in our diet, but lots and lots of meat. And there are even some anthropologists who argue that our ancestors were even heavier meat eaters, maybe up to 70%. That's a pretty controversial claim, but it's one of the ones that's out there based on the fact that these guys are hunting what we call megafauna, like mammoths. They're getting a lot of meat at times. Okay, so what are the consequences for our health from shifting from a plant-based diet to an animal-based diet, or a more animal-based diet? Just checking the time here. Pathogens are pretty highly adapted to their hosts because hosts don't want to be eaten, as I mentioned. That includes plants. So plants have sophisticated immune systems and sophisticated defenses against pathogens. So these red guys are plant pathogens. And these plant pathogens that infect plants have figured out the secret key code for getting into plant cells and evading plant immune systems to infect plants. But what that means is that they are very poor at infecting animal cells. So if you're eating a plant-based diet, you are very unlikely to get infected with a plant-based pathogen. In fact, it's extremely rare for us humans to be infected with plant-based pathogens. It does happen, but it's almost always in somebody with a compromised immune system, somebody that's undergoing chemotherapy or has HIV. It's exceedingly rare otherwise. And so what that means is on the plant-based diet, things like chimpanzees were taking in lots of plants, including the toxins that were in those plants. But the pathogens that were infecting those plants were extremely unlikely to infect our ancestors with plant-based diets. Now, there obviously are plant-based foodborne illnesses, but those are almost always from bodily fluids from other animals, urine, feces that get on the plants, contaminate them. And so we can get sick from plant-based foods, but not from the plant pathogens themselves. In contrast, as we began to feed on mammals, we are mammals. And the pathogens that infect mammals have figured out the key code to get into mammal cells and infect mammals, including us. And so the risk that an animal pathogen in an animal that is now being hunted will infect us is vastly higher than the probability that a plant-based pathogen will infect an animal. And so what I am arguing here, my colleagues and I, is that as we transition from a more plant-based diet in the Miocene and Pliocene and began to transition to a more meat-based diet in the Pleistocene, we began to suffer increasing rates of zoonotic spillovers of these pathogens that are infecting the animals that we're hunting. Okay, is there any evidence for that? Yes, there's quite a bit. So we've all heard of the wet market in Wuhan, but those things are very common around the world. Actually, millions of people depend on bushmeat even today. And guess what? Public health folks were well aware of the risk of spillover at these bushmeat markets. And so there's lots and lots of studies. And when you think about hunting and bushmeat, there's all kinds of opportunities for that animal pathogen to jump over into you. When you are tracking an animal, you are going to be encountering a lot of mosquitoes and other insects, ticks that may have been feeding on that animal and now are biting you. Then as you approach to kill the animal, it doesn't want to be killed. I'll show you a slide in a minute. Guy got his nose bit off. So getting injured by these animals is extremely common. And then you butcher them. And especially folks in our past who are using stone tools, anybody who's ever done any flint knapping knows it's basically impossible to do that without getting lots of cuts on your hands. You're basically chipping up glass. So there are all these pathways by which pathogens could jump over from the prey animals into us. And then, of course, we eat it, right? So the evidence is things like Ebola, HIV, monkeypox, SARS-CoV-1, and possibly SARS-CoV-2 are all zoonotic pathogens that jumped over from animal species into us. Many bushmeat species host zoonotic pathogens. They're mostly mammals. Some are reptiles, a few are birds. A lot of them are intestinal worms or other sort of parasitic worms. Bacteria is pretty common. Viruses and protozoa are also fairly common. From hunting, so these are the folks I work with. This is a Congo Basin forager, nose bit off by a gorilla that he was hunting. These guys are much higher risk for zoonotic spillovers than farmers who are living in the exact same environment. It's the fact that they are hunting that puts them at increased risk, it seems. Some examples: simian foamy virus, human T lymphotrophic virus type 1, monkeypox, Ebola. In fact, the highest levels of antibodies to Ebola ever found are in this population here. And severe bites from non-human primates are a major risk factor for infection. Okay, so if hunting and transitioning to a meat-based diet did put us at greater risk, we should see genetic changes in our immune systems, because this presumably has been going on for 2.5 million years. And that's enough time for natural selection to act. So what's the evidence for that? Are human immune systems as potential meat eaters different from plant-based eaters' immune systems and other aspects of our pathogen defense. And yes, there's quite a bit of evidence that our human immune system is somewhat unique among the apes and the primates. So the first piece of evidence is stomach acidity. So if you remember your high school chemistry, low numbers mean low pH. This is a pH scale here. Low pH is highly acidic. 7 is neutral here. So this is a stomach acid pH in a wide variety of species. Each dot here is one species. And the species have been grouped by their diets. So over here we have herbivores. And the primates is a little bit hard to see here. Some of them are in this kind of reddish brown here, mammals here. So a lot of the primates and other plant-based eaters are up here. They have very unacidic stomachs. Now, why does stomach acidity matter? That's a major barrier to infection. Highly acidic stomachs kill pathogens, but they're costly to maintain. And so having a highly acidic stomach is a clue that you're getting lots of pathogens in your diet. And so who has the most acidic stomachs here are the carnivores and the scavengers down here, highly acidic stomachs. Where are humans? Right down here with those guys. So we humans have a highly acidic stomach, which protects us, presumably, and all these other meat eaters from infections that we're getting through our meat-based diet, because acids kill pathogens. So that's piece of evidence number one. Another piece of evidence comes from studies with LPS. What is LPS? It's lipopolysaccharide, and it is a component of bacteria. And it's an ancient component of that. So all bacteria have this in their cells, cell walls, cell membranes. And so the immune systems of many, many species have evolved to detect not the bacteria specifically, but this particular compound, LPS. So if your body detects LPS, it often mounts an immune response. So what this chart is how much LPS does it take to trigger an immune response? And so these are all the different species that have been tested here. And these are the quantities of LPS it took to get them to trigger an immune response. And what you can see is most of them are up here, a few down a little bit lower here. Here's humans, way on the far right. Tiny amounts of LPS are required to trigger an immune response in humans. What that means is that we are extraordinarily sensitive to infections with bacteria, and we mount immune responses at much, much lower levels of that than many, many other species, suggesting again that bacterial infections were much more of a risk to us than they were for all of these other species, all of which are plant eaters. Yet another piece of evidence. Every cell in your body, just about, is coated with proteins called glycoproteins. These are basically sugary carbohydrate proteins, and they have a number of functions. They protect us from infections, but they also engage in cell-cell interaction. So your cells are all talking to each other. That's how your bodies work. And a lot of that signaling is through these specific parts of these glycoproteins called sialic acids. Those are these little diamond shapes here. And so those are critical for bodily function. And they also play a critical role in your immune defenses. But what that means is that pathogens have also co-evolved to exploit these areas to get into your cells, because for a pathogen to do its dirty work, typically it's got to get into your cell, hijack your cell one way or another. So these are all the various kinds of pathogens that have evolved to exploit different sialic acids on the surface of our cells. And what we have with this particular one is that we humans, compared to other primates, other apes, we have lost the ability to make this sialic acid completely. But that was a major pathway for some very dangerous pathogens, including malaria. And so the hypothesis is the reason that we've lost this particular sialic acid is that would then have prevented those pathogens from being able to enter our cells via that pathway. And what's striking about it is what we see over here on this chart, is that had all kinds of downstream effects on our evolution of our immune system. So all these little yellow boxes here are changes. So here's where we diverged from chimpanzees right here. So here's chimps right here, 2 species of them. This is our last common ancestor. This is gorillas. There's our last common ancestor. These are orangutans. There's our last common ancestor. And there's a few little changes in our relatives, but there's a large number of changes in our lineage compared to, and it's after we diverged from chimps. And so these changes are thought to have occurred right around that 2 to 3 million year point when we transitioned from a plant-based diet to an animal-based diet. There were pretty dramatic changes in the coatings of our cells, presumably due to the different pathogen environment we were encountering at that time. And I think this is my final piece of evidence. Many of you probably have heard of anthrax. It's a deadly zoonotic pathogen. It will kill you. It's a bacterium. We get it from animals, so it's a zoonotic. We don't transmit it from human to human. And it comes in through a receptor, a protein that we make, that our bodies make, called the anthrax receptor, because this is the receptor that anthrax exploits to get into your cells and infect you. And what's interesting is that our expression levels of this receptor protein are dramatically lower than in chimpanzees or other primates, suggesting that we have downregulated, and there's a whole other host of tests in this study that I don't show you here that suggest that this downregulation of this receptor in humans, but not in our closest relative, protects us from anthrax bacterium that comes over from animals from getting into our cells. So yet another piece of evidence, and there are actually 2 stages. The first stage in downregulation is found in all humans, and it is dated again to that 2 to 3 million year period. And then there was a second phase that onset in very much more recently in Europe when we began herding animals. And again, we're exposed to probably increased risk of anthrax. Okay, now here's the final piece of evidence, actually. And this could actually go in another part of the talk too, but I'll put it here. When we eat certain foods, it actually can trigger an immune response. And immune responses are energetically costly. They take energy. We all know that when we get sick, man, we're tired, we just want to sleep. And most of that is not from the pathogen that infects us. Most of that is from our immune system ramping up, taking all the energy from all the other stuff that you would normally do and putting it into your immune response. Your body needs to generate tons of new proteins and new immune cells to fight the infection, and that takes lots of energy. So immune responses are expensive. Guess which foods trigger inflammation, which is the immune response here? It's animal-based foods. Those are the ones in red here. The ones that actually kind of protect you, that are anti-inflammatory, are all these, most of which are plant-based foods. The one exception here is vitamin D, which is anti-inflammatory, and yet it also is common in animal foods. So exactly, this is the outlier. I don't know what's going on here. But what it seems like is that your body knows that animal-based foods are potentially dangerous in terms of posing an infection risk, and preemptively upregulates an inflammatory response just in case you are exposed to a pathogen. And it's doing the opposite with plant foods. It's saying, okay, those are okay, downregulate. Okay, so what does all this have to do with drug use and recreational drug use and spices? So our basic idea, and this is not our idea, this is an idea that's been out there for quite a while, that we can think of our local flora, the local plant environment, as a type of pharmacy. Not just for us humans, but for many other species as well. There we go. So what's the evidence for that? Well, plants, as I mentioned, are attacked by pathogens. They're attacked by parasites and bacteria and viruses and worms, actually. And it's as bad for them as it is for us. But they can't run away. And they are also attacked by insect herbivores and vertebrate herbivores. And these are the ones I'm going to focus on. These are organisms with nervous systems. So what do plants do to defend themselves from insects and herbivores when they can't run away? They defend themselves in many ways, but one of the ways is to produce toxins. And plants have evolved somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million unique chemicals, about 5,000 to 15,000 per species, most of which play some role in plant defense. Some are also in pollinator signaling. That's a separate issue. But many of these plant defensive chemicals are neurotoxic. And those are targeting animals with nervous systems. And the way they work, things like nicotine and cocaine and opioids, is that what nicotine does is mimics a neuroreceptor in your body called acetylcholine. And our body to work has to engage in cellular signaling, and our brains to work, and our nervous system. And it uses tiny, tiny quantities of chemicals called neurotransmitters. One of them is dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and nicotine in particular mimics acetylcholine, and it binds to your acetylcholine receptors. And what your acetylcholine receptors do in your body is it's one of the things they do is it's how your brain talks to your muscles. So what nicotine does is blocks that receptor. It's what's called a acetylcholine receptor agonist. And that means your brain can't talk to your muscles anymore. And of course, your muscles include your heart and your diaphragm. So your heart stops, you stop breathing. And it's very easy to die from a nicotine overdose. So all of these substances that I'm going to be talking about, or most of them, have these neurotoxic properties, and they all work basically that way. But what that means is the same things that kill worms in plants might also kill our worms, and not just our worms, but many of our pathogens and parasites, the compounds that plants have evolved to defend themselves against their pests and pathogens and herbivores might also defend us against ours. Is there any evidence for this? Well, there's actually quite a bit of evidence now that we humans aren't the only ones to have figured this out. There's now evidence in 71 species from 7 mammalian orders, including primates, carnivores, rodents, that they self-medicate, that when they are sick, they seek out toxic plants and eat them as a form of self-medication. And we even have evidence for that in one of our close relatives, the Neanderthals. So in this study, this is called dental calculus, the stuff that we usually call tartar, this kind of crap that accumulates on your teeth. And we can actually, when we dig up these fossils, we can scrape this stuff off and analyze it, and it gives us a record of what that individual has been eating for the last year or two. And so in the analysis of this Neanderthal dental calculus, this stuff right here, they found a lot of plant substances, plant foods, but they also found that this person was infected with a pathogen, and they actually found DNA of that pathogen right here. That's this guy right here, a gastrointestinal parasite. And they found penicillin in here, and they found aspirin in here. So it looks like this person, this Neanderthal, was infected and was self-medicating maybe with compounds that were basically could easily have helped them. An analgesic and a antibiotic. Now, what evidence do we have that these plant compounds and spices actually do have medical benefits? Well, there's actually quite a bit of evidence. So what I have on the left-hand side are different diseases. What I have on the right-hand side here are different spices. And the purple bars are if the spices were helpful, and the red bars if they were harmful. And what you can see in many of these disease processes, brain diseases, intestinal diseases, inflammatory diseases, dementia, cancers, hypertension, there's quite a bit of evidence that one or more spice compounds actually had a positive effect, a healthy effect, in that particular disease condition. And over on the right-hand side here, I have spices like garlic and ginger and turmeric and fennel, and again, what is the evidence? How many studies? And these are the numbers of studies or results. And what you can see is there's quite a few studies that found some positive medicinal benefit from garlic, from ginger, from turmeric, from fennel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's quite a bit of evidence that spices do have medicinal benefits. Now, the ones that I have been focusing on my research are parasites with nervous systems. Here's a bunch of them. Things like fleas and mites and ticks and intestinal worms. And what this chart here is basically just saying millions and millions of people are suffering from infections, either from these things directly or from diseases that they transmit. They are still, even today, a huge health burden. But the fact that they have nervous systems means you can kill them with neurotoxic substances like nicotine. And in fact, most popular drugs, recreational drugs, are in fact exactly plant neurotoxins. So this is a wild tobacco plant. There's about 60 species of tobacco. About half of them produce nicotine. This is one of the ones. This is Nicotiana attenuata. It's in North America. And it produces a lot of nicotine in its leaves, and it's doing that not for our benefit, not to produce cigarettes. It's doing that to defend itself against insects and other herbivores. But it was for years, in fact, even still today, it's used to deworm livestock. Nicotine is really great at killing worms. And that's in livestock. In humans, if you look in the ethnomedical texts, tobacco is mentioned constantly as a treatment for intestinal worms. And many organic farmers still use it today as a pesticide. And actually, in many developing countries, nicotine insecticides are still pretty common. Here in the US, they were banned by the EPA many years ago because not only are they dangerous to insects, but they're dangerous to livestock and dogs and cats and humans. So it's just too dangerous. Ricoline is another acetylcholine agonist. It's found in this drug called betel nut, which is very widely used in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This compound is used if you go to your vet to get your dog dewormed. It's quite likely that they're going to deworm them with this compound, which is the active compound in this very widely used recreational drug. And if you look in traditional medicine, Chinese medicine, it also mentions using the areca nut, which is the source of this compound, as a deworming medicine. Caffeine, another plant defensive chemical, widely used as a pesticide by organic farmers. These are the legal ones, so we know something about them. The illegal ones, we don't know as much about them, but there is evidence for at least cocaine, that it also kills pests of the coca plant. And we have quite a bit of evidence that tobacco has been used for a long time. So this is a pretty recent study that found human use of tobacco in the Pleistocene America. So tobacco plants are only found in the Americas and the Pacific. There is one tobacco species in Africa. I haven't been able to find any evidence that anybody uses it for anything. But of course, in the Americas and the Pacific, tobacco is widely used, and we can push that evidence now back into the Pleistocene. And more recently, this is a European depiction of what are called tobacco shamans in Brazil here in the 1500s. So very widespread practice in the Americas was specialists called healers or shamans. And in the Americas, they almost always used tobacco in their healing ceremonies. And of course, and here's a woodcut of illustrating that going on here. And given that nicotine does have a lot of antiparasitic benefits, it's likely that that actually did help at least some of the time. Now, my own work is with these Congo Basin foragers, commonly known as pygmies. That's kind of considered a derogatory term these days, so I'll refer to them as Congo Basin foragers. But they're hunter-gatherers, and I thought this would be an ideal place to test this idea that drug use, and if you haven't put it together yet, basically what I'm arguing here is we like these things because they are valuable medicines. We don't think of them consciously as medicines, but that's why we want them and why we like them, is because they actually do have medicinal benefits. So to test this, I thought this population would be perfect because I knew that They were very heavy tobacco users and very heavy cannabis users. And they had high levels of worm infections. Now, the ideal test of this idea that recreational drug use should really be reconceptualized as self-medication, as we see in other animals, would be to infect all you guys with worms and see if you take up smoking. That would probably be unethical. I haven't really pushed that one past my IRB committee. But the opposite, where we take people who are smoking and are already infected with worms, and we treat them for worms, they should smoke less. So this was the ideal population. So what we did is each dot here is one person. And in the ACA, it's only the men that use tobacco and cannabis. None of the women do, with just really few exceptions. So these are all men. And cotinine is a nicotine metabolite. So we measured on the vertical scale, we basically have everybody basically poop in a jar, in a tube, and then we count the eggs in their feces, and that gives us a measure of how many worms they have. And everybody had some. I think there might have been one person that didn't have any, but just about, it was almost 100% infection. So everybody had some worm eggs in their stool, and some people just had a few, and some people had a lot, and that's what this vertical axis is. So guys up here are heavily infected, guys down here are much less infected. And then on the horizontal axis here, we have a level of how much they're smoking. So basically how much nicotine is in their system. So cotinine is just the way we measure nicotine levels. And what you can see is there's a lot of noise here, a lot of variation. But for the heaviest tobacco users, they had the fewest eggs in their stool, worm eggs. So that was part one of the study. So we started that here. We said, hey, that's pretty interesting. Heaviest tobacco users have the least worm infections. And by the way, when we ask them, why are you smoking? They don't say, oh, I'm trying to get rid of my worms. They give basically the same reasons that we would. It gives me more energy, makes me a better hunter, kind of keeps me warm. They give performance enhancement type explanations for their tobacco use. But then what we did, we said, okay, this is the start of the study here. And we did a double-blind placebo-controlled trial where we randomly gave half these guys placebo, exactly in a pill that looked like this, and half of them albendazole, which is an extremely effective deworming compound. And we did this double-blind randomized, so we didn't know who was getting the treatment. They didn't know. We just randomized them. But we had all their baseline worm and all their baseline tobacco use. And what we have up here is our prediction that in the control group, in the placebo group, there would be, this is how many worms did they have to begin with? And in the control group, we expect no change. And we're going to look at these guys 2 weeks later and see what their tobacco looks like. So from time 0 to time 1. So in the placebo group, we expect no change in their tobacco use. In the treatment group, the guys who got the albendazole, well, if you weren't infected with worms in the first place, we expect no effect. But if you were heavily infected, we expect your tobacco use to drop fairly dramatically. So this is our predictions up here. This is what we actually see. Now, for some reason, in our control group, tobacco use actually went up in the control group. I don't know why. But the guys with the heaviest worms were actually smoking more at time 2 relative to time 1. But in our treatment group, it goes down. So the guys that we treated actually reduced their tobacco use 2 weeks later. So some evidence that maybe something's going on here, a connection between infections and willingness or motivations or to use tobacco in this case. Okay, and then we found similar effects for cannabis. The heaviest cannabis users were also the least infected. And you get reinfected pretty quick. So we actually came back a year later. And what we found a year later is that the heaviest tobacco and cannabis users were the least likely to be reinfected with worms 1 year later. So it seems to have had a protective effect. The fact that they were the heaviest users, it seemed to kind of protect them from reinfection. Again, suggesting a medicinal benefit there. Okay, and the final part of my talk here, these things are toxic. And medicines are toxic. So probably many of you have taken an antibiotic at some point, and it kind of makes you often sick to your stomach. That's always the problem when we're dealing with medicines, is that they work because they are toxic. They kill your pathogens, but that means they also do some damage to you. So we don't just guzzle these things down, we titrate our use of them. And so if our perspective is correct, that we really need to think about recreational drugs as medicines, that means we need to think about the trade-off between their medicinal benefits and their toxic costs. And so this part of the talk, I'm going to look at what is the influence of these costs, of the costs of the toxins, of nicotine in particular is what I'm going to look at here, on patterns of use. Well, there are strong arguments that there are certain categories of individuals that should be particularly sensitive to the costs of tobacco use or nicotine or these bitter compounds in general. So here's our theoretical model. We expect children to be extremely reluctant to use these compounds because their bodies and brains in particular are developing rapidly. Remember, these things are neurotoxins. They interfere with neurotransmission and neural signaling. And the last thing you want to do when your brain is developing is interfere with neural signaling. So we argue that use of these recreational drugs should be very rare in childhood. By the time you get to about age 10, your brain is almost adult size. It's not fully developed, but that cost-benefit trade-off is going to begin to tip from costs to benefits, because actually it's in late childhood and early adolescence in these populations, when you begin to get high levels of worm infections. So we expect drug use to rise rapidly in both sexes. But once you get to about age 18, women are going to now worry not about their own brain development and body development, but the brain and body development of their potential offspring. Because in our populations, women are going to start getting pregnant right at the end of adolescence here. So we expect, and especially in high fertility contexts, female use of these drugs to really level off at a pretty low level, but male use to continue to skyrocket and level off at a high level. Then, once women have passed the childbearing years in this postmenopausal, the risk to fetuses doesn't exist anymore, and we expect their drug use to now go up and kind of reach male levels in this post-reproductive phase here. So what do we actually see? We see something that, and I will admit, we put this theoretical model when we had some of these data already. So it's kind of a pre-hoc, post-hoc, and in particular, I had seen these graphs before. So I'll confess to that one. What these are is a very large cross-national study in a large number of countries. These are all the different countries here. This is age along the x-axis. So here's 0 all the way up to age 60 here. And this is 4 drugs: alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and cocaine. And what we see is the percent of users. So if you're an alcohol user or a tobacco user or a cannabis user or a cocaine user, when did you start using it? When was your age of onset? When was the first age you started using one of these drugs, if you are a user of this drug? And what you can see is from about 0 to age 10, it's 0. None of the people that use these drugs started using it in that 0 to 10 time frame. When did they all start using it? In adolescence. There's just there's a huge skyrocket of onset of drug use in adolescence. And this is true in these more nation-state type populations here. These are our Aka hunter-gatherers. I told you that women don't use it, but we see the same pattern in the males. No tobacco use or cannabis use. I think this one's cannabis, this one's tobacco, I think. 0 in the kids, and then pretty high levels in the adolescent boys, and then very high levels in the adolescent men. Now you might think, well, this is because parents don't want their kids using cocaine. I don't want my 5-year-old snorting coke. So that's why this is low. So we said, yeah, okay, that's reasonable. It's reasonable. I don't want them puffing on cigarettes or taking shots here. That's what explains this low level. So we said, let's look at a drug that is not socially prohibited, caffeine. Caffeine is actually added to foods that are marketed to kids. It's in Coca-Cola. It's in chocolate. It's rated by the FDA as safe. This is the age pattern for caffeine, and this is a large, nationally representative, urine-based, drug testing sample of how much caffeine is in your system. Here's the kids, here's the adolescents, here's the young adults, here's the old adults. We see the exact same pattern. Very low levels of caffeine use, even in kids that are being served things like Coca-Cola that have caffeine in them, and then a rapid increase in caffeine levels in adolescence and adulthood. And here is actually looking at it by sex. So the blue lines are the males, the red lines are the females. And again, a lot of the explanations for sex differences, I'll come to those in a second, are based on claims that women are discouraged from using these drugs, but they're really not discouraged from using coffee and caffeine and tea. And yet what we see is that exact same pattern, that as you go from childhood through adolescence, again, this is urine caffeine-based test in a nationally representative sample. Males and females are going up equally, and then females level off at a lower level than males. Males keep going up. And then they both go down. There's a little bit of a bump here post-menopause. Females go up again and then drop down. So this kind of roughly corresponds to our theoretical picture here. And then the final stuff I'll talk about here, I'm pretty much at time, is our latest study. We haven't published this yet. We're still working on these data. But we've got tobacco use data in males and females, 2.6 million females, about 1 million males. Tobacco use in these low and middle income countries that you see in color here. And the sex difference is just remarkable. So each dot here is the average, the prevalence in each of these countries of tobacco use. And what we have on the x-axis here are the male levels, which range from down here around 5% up to over 60%. What we have on the vertical axis is the rate of female use in those same countries. These are the different regions: Africa, Americas, Eastern Mediterranean, Europe, Southeast Asia, Western Pacific. And this diagonal line would be the line where male and female use is equal. And what you can see is every dot is well below that line. Females, the maximum female is about is in this country right here, 15%. Almost all of them are below 10%, and many are below 5%. Whereas male use is very, very high here. So what we're seeing is a dramatic sex difference in tobacco use. And our hypothesis is that this may be related to the fact that women are avoiding these substances because they are dangerous for fetuses, for child rearing. So our hypothesis, if we look at that, does that predict the variation at the individual level between individual level women? And we have quite a bit of evidence that it does. So women who are married and presumably moving into that child rearing phase, these numbers, when they're less than 1, means that predicts that married women are using less likely to use tobacco than unmarried women. Men that are married are more likely to use tobacco than unmarried men. Women who are pregnant are less likely to use tobacco than women who are not pregnant, and women who are breastfeeding are less likely to use tobacco than are women that are not breastfeeding. This chart's a little bit hard to understand, but we also thought women who are caring for infants and really young kids should also be less likely to use tobacco. So this is the age of the woman's youngest child. And then these are age categories. So these are the youngest women, these are the teen moms, the young adult moms, the sort of 30-year-old moms, 40-year-old moms, and then the really old moms. And what you can see is, going this way, that the women with the youngest kids in their age category are the least likely to use tobacco. So having young kids in the house seems to protect women from using tobacco, again, suggesting that they are worried about the health of their kids. In fact, when we did a study on this where we were interviewing the women, we stupidly forgot to ask them about this, but they brought it up themselves, because we would ask them, who criticizes you if you use tobacco? And we were expecting them to say their husbands or their fathers or their pastors or priests. And they're like, oh, my kids, they hate it. They throw my cigarettes out. They flush them down the toilet. So that was actually like, oh, why didn't we were dumb. We didn't think of that. But yeah, the kids were the biggest critics of moms who were trying to use tobacco. Here's our tobacco use by age in these 3.7 million people here. Well, you can see very rapid increase. Each line here is a separate country. Very rapid increase in adolescence. This is age 0, 20, 30, 40. And then it levels off for almost all adulthood here. Women, you can't really see it here. There's a rapid increase, but at much lower levels. Here we're going from 0 to 10%, and males we're going from 0 to 80%. So these scales are very, very different. So females are going from 0 to maybe 5% or less here. And what we were hoping is it would really be flat across the reproductive years. It's not, but you can still see it's a much more gradual increase across the lifespan. Whereas men, it's a very rapid early increase and then leveling off through almost all adulthood. So there's pretty dramatic sex differences in the trajectories here. Cultural transmission matters. One of our biggest protective effects for both men and women is education. The more years of education they have, the less likely they are to use tobacco, unless they go to college, in which case it gets bumps up here. To conclude, 5 minutes later, the human dietary niche involved fewer anti-infective foods like plant-based foods and more infective animal foods. Our immune system appears to have devolved genetically from those of our ape relatives 2 to 3 million years ago. There's evidence for self-medication in many, many species, that many species use plant substances to self-medicate illnesses, and there's evidence that our close relatives and ancestors were doing that too. And we also see even tobacco use early on, used for maybe medicinal purposes. Spices and common recreational plant drugs do provide medicinal benefits, perhaps explaining why we like them or want them. Oops, sorry. And I didn't talk about this, but we've all heard about shamans and shamanism. Medical expertise, we think, becomes increasingly important, and that gives rise to what we call shamans or healers in many of these hunter-gatherer societies. And then drug toxicity in general really has had a profound impact on global patterns of use by age and sex. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.